Could the way you're fasting be preventing you from experiencing a deeper connection with God? Are you making these 4 common mistakes when you fast? Fasting is among the most personal practices we engage in to draw closer to God. It's intended to deepen our relationship, strengthen us spiritually, and help us align with His will. Yet sometimes, without even realizing it, we might be making mistakes that hinder our fasting from having its intended impact. These errors aren't always obvious. You might not even be aware you're making them. But the Bible offers clear guidance on what we should avoid. So what are these mistakes? What does the Bible actually teach about how we should fast? In this video, we'll delve into 4 common errors people make when they fast. These aren't just trivial oversights. They can affect how God responds to our fasting. We'll uncover what Scripture says about each one and, more importantly, how to correct them. For many of us, fasting is a spiritual discipline, a practice we turn to in times of seeking God's guidance or deepening our faith. We abstain from food or certain pleasures, aiming to focus more on God. But it's not just the act of fasting that matters, it's how we approach it. You see, in the Bible, Jesus and the prophets provide specific instructions on how to fast properly. They warn us about common pitfalls we can fall into, traps that might render our fasting ineffective. Imagine this. You're fasting regularly, but somehow it doesn't seem to bring you closer to God. You're not feeling that spiritual connection. You start to wonder, is God noticing? The truth is, even with the best intentions, we might be undermining our own fasting without realizing it. The Bible clearly tells us what we should avoid to ensure that doesn't happen. Today, we're going to look at these 4 mistakes, errors that can subtly creep into your fasting, yet have a significant impact. And for each one, I'll show you what Scripture says and how to correct them, so your fasting can be more meaningful, more powerful, and truly align with God's will. Mistake 1, fasting with the wrong motives. Have you ever found yourself fasting out of habit or obligation without truly focusing on God? Could this be stopping you from genuinely connecting with Him? One common mistake people make when fasting is doing it for the wrong reasons. Over time, fasting can become just another religious activity, something we do because it's expected, rather than out of a heartfelt desire to seek God. For example, someone might fast during a specific season because everyone else in their community is doing it. Initially, they might have been sincere, but after repeating it year after year, it can become merely a ritual. It turns into a checklist item rather than a meaningful act of devotion to God. The Bible warns us about this. In Isaiah 58:3-4, the people ask, "Why have we fasted?" they say, "and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves, and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers." This passage highlights that merely going without food isn't what pleases God. It's about the heart behind the fast. When we fast with the wrong motives, we miss the entire purpose of fasting. It's meant to be a time of drawing near to God, humbling ourselves, and seeking His face. It's not about fulfilling a religious duty or appearing devout. It's about a genuine desire to connect with God and align ourselves with His will. When our fasting lacks sincere purpose, we risk treating it like a mere formality. The focus shifts from seeking God to simply going through the motions, and when that happens, the spiritual power of fasting is lost. It's like abstaining from food, but filling the space with distractions. The connection with God weakens. So, how do we avoid this mistake? The solution is simple but requires intentional effort. Focus on fasting with the right motives, seeking God wholeheartedly. Remember, God values the sincerity and intention behind your fast, not just the physical act. One way to do this is to set aside time during your fast to pray and meditate on Scripture. Before you begin, ask yourself, why am I fasting? What am I seeking from God? How can this fast help me draw nearer to Him? Let your fasting be driven by these reflections. For example, instead of just not eating, you might use meal times to pray or read the Bible. You could say, "Lord, As I fast today, I seek to know you more. Help me to understand your will and walk in your ways. It's not about the length of the fast or how strict it is, but about the sincerity of your heart. It's that genuine desire to connect with God that makes the difference. Also, be open to God's leading during your fast. Sometimes He may reveal areas in your life that need change or prompt you to take specific actions. Fasting isn't just about abstaining. It's about listening and responding to God's voice. In summary, the key to overcoming the mistake of fasting with the wrong motives is to approach it with sincerity and a heart focused on God. Engage in fasting as a meaningful practice to deepen your relationship with Him, not as a mere ritual. Mistake 2, fasting to impress others. Have you ever noticed someone making a point of telling everyone they're fasting, perhaps seeking admiration for their devotion? Is it possible that, at times, even unintentionally, we fast more for the recognition of others than for a genuine connection with God? One of the most subtle yet serious mistakes in fasting is doing it for the wrong audience, especially when the purpose shifts from humbling ourselves before God to impressing people. Sometimes, individuals fast publicly not to honor God, but to showcase their piety, seeking approval, admiration, or even praise from those around them. Jesus specifically warns against this. In Matthew 6:16-18, He says, "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full." In this passage, Jesus addresses a common problem: people making a show of their fasting to gain recognition from others. But this isn't just an issue from ancient times. Today, the temptation to showcase our fasting is very real. For instance, someone might post on social media about their fast, drawing attention to their spiritual practice. While there can be appropriate times to share for encouragement, it's important to check our motives. Are we seeking to uplift others, or are we seeking praise? This type of fasting is not rooted in humility or sincerity. It's rooted in the desire for human recognition. The danger here is that fasting, which should be a personal and sacred act of devotion, becomes about appearances. Instead of focusing on our relationship with God, the focus shifts to how others perceive us. This turns fasting into an act of hypocrisy. Jesus uses the word hypocrites for a reason. Hypocrites are people who put on a show of holiness without truly living it. Fasting just to be seen by others might look spiritual on the outside, but it's empty on the inside. The heart of fasting is lost when it becomes about performance rather than genuine devotion. This doesn't mean that others can never know we're fasting. There are times when group fasts are called for, and it's natural that others might be aware. The key is to always examine our motives. Are we fasting to seek God, or are we fasting to impress others? The solution is to return fasting to what it's meant to be, a humble and sincere practice between you and God. Jesus gives clear instructions, but when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting. Matthew 6:17-18. This means we should carry on as usual, without drawing attention to ourselves, so that our fasting is seen by God, not people. When you fast, whether others know or not, focus on the heart of the fast, not on the audience. Ensure that your fasting is about seeking God and not about how you appear to others. The effectiveness of your fast doesn't depend on others noticing, but on your sincerity before God. Here's a simple mindset shift that can help. When you fast, think of it as a private offering to God. Whether you're at work, with friends, or alone, remember that God is the only one who truly matters in that moment. He sees your heart, and that's what counts. Mistake 3. Lacking faith. During your fast, have you ever started a fast but deep down doubted whether it would make a difference? Do you find yourself questioning whether God will truly respond to your fasting? One of the most significant mistakes people make when fasting is doubting its effectiveness. We might go through the physical act of fasting, but in our hearts, we're uncertain if God is really paying attention or if anything will change. This lack of faith can undermine the very purpose of our fast. Imagine embarking on a journey, but constantly thinking you won't reach your destination. Your doubts would dampen your efforts, and that hesitation would be evident. The same happens when we fast without trusting that God will honor our sacrifice. It's like we're half-heartedly engaging in the fast, already preparing for it not to yield results. The Bible is clear about the importance of faith. In Hebrews 11:6 it states, "And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." This verse emphasizes that faith is essential in our relationship with God. When we fast with doubt, we're questioning God's ability to act in our lives. Lack of faith during fasting not only limits our connection with God, but also diminishes the spiritual power of fasting itself. When we doubt, we're essentially saying that we don't fully trust God's promises or his responsiveness. This can create a cycle where our lack of faith leads to a lack of results, which in turn feeds more doubt. Think of fasting as a time of deep spiritual engagement and surrender. We are coming to God, denying ourselves, because we trust in his power and his plan. When we fast without faith, we're holding back, not fully committing to the process. It's as if we're saying, "I'll fast, but I don't really expect anything to happen." In Mark 9:23-24, Jesus says, "If you can," said Jesus. "Everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." This passage highlights the importance of faith and also acknowledges that it's okay to ask God to strengthen our faith when we're struggling. The solution to this mistake is to fast with confidence, trust, and faith in God's power and timing. This means believing that God honors your fasting and will respond in the way that's best, even if it's not in the way you expect. First, understand that faith is about trusting in God's character and his promises. It's about believing that he is good, that he loves you, and that he is working for your ultimate good. When we fast with faith, we're acknowledging that God's ways are higher than ours, and we trust that his response, whether it's immediate or delayed, is part of his perfect plan. Fasting with faith also means being patient and persistent. Sometimes, the breakthroughs or answers we're seeking don't come right away. It's in these times that our faith is tested and strengthened. Remember, God is working even when we don't see it. Here's a practical way to strengthen your faith during fasting. As you fast, spend time reading scriptures that reinforce God's promises and faithfulness. Remind yourself of times in your life when God has come through for you. This will build your confidence in his ability to act. Another tip is to be honest with God about your struggles. If you're finding it hard to believe, pray and ask him to help you. Just like the man in Mark 9, you can say, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." God honors sincere prayers, even when we're wrestling with doubts. Finally, surround yourself with a community of faith. Share your fasting journey with trusted friends who can encourage you and pray with you. Sometimes, leaning on the faith of others can bolster our own. Mistake 4, neglecting to align your fast with God's will. Have you ever fasted for something specific, only to feel disappointed when things didn't turn out as you hoped? Could it be that your fasting was more focused on your desires than on seeking God's will? A common mistake we make is centering our fasting on our personal agendas without considering God's greater plan. It's natural to fast for things we deeply desire, whether it's a particular outcome, a need, or a change in circumstances. But when our fasting is solely about what we want, we might miss the bigger picture, aligning ourselves with God's purposes. In James 4:3, we're cautioned, "When you ask, you do not receive, because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures." This verse highlights that our motives matter to God. If we're fasting with selfish intentions, we may not receive the response we're hoping for. Sometimes, without realizing it, we treat fasting like a bargaining chip, thinking that by fasting we can get God to do what we want. For example, someone might fast to get a certain job, believing that their sacrifice will compel God to grant their request. But God is not manipulated by our actions. He desires a relationship with us and seeks our trust in His sovereignty. When our fasting is disconnected from God's will, we set ourselves up for disappointment. We might feel that our fasting was in vain or that God isn't responding. But the truth is, God may have a different plan, one that ultimately is better for us, even if we can't see it at the moment. Another issue with focusing solely on our desires is that it can make our spiritual practices self-centered. Instead of seeking to know God's will and align ourselves with His purposes, we end up trying to fit God into our plan. This hinders our spiritual growth and keeps us from fully trusting in His wisdom. Jesus Himself modeled the importance of aligning our will with God's. In Luke 22:42, facing immense suffering, He prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Even in His most agonizing moment, Jesus submitted His desires to the Father's will. There are a couple of things you can start focusing on right away. But first, let us stand strong in our fasting together and comment, "I surrender to Jesus," to join us in worship. My experience with growing in faith is that we need to shift our focus during fasting. Instead of only asking for what we want, we should use fasting as a time to seek God's will and align ourselves with His purposes. This means being open to His guidance, even when it doesn't match our own plans. Here's a practical way to start. When you begin a fast, dedicate it to seeking God's will. Pray, "Lord, as I fast, reveal your will to me. Help me to desire what you desire and to follow where you lead." This kind of prayer demonstrates humility and a willingness to let God direct your path. Another key is to spend time in prayer and scripture during your fast, asking God to speak to you. Instead of focusing on specific outcomes, focus on knowing God more deeply. For example, rather than fasting solely for a solution to a problem, fast to draw closer to God and to gain His wisdom and perspective on the situation. Finally, remember that fasting is not about earning God's favor or getting what we want, but about surrendering to Him. As we humble ourselves through fasting, we open our hearts to be transformed by His Spirit. As Proverbs 3:5-6 encourages us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." Trusting in that truth can transform the way we fast and help us develop a stronger or more faithful relationship with God. So the 4 mistakes to avoid during your fasting are fasting with the wrong motives, fasting to impress others, lacking faith in God's response, and neglecting to align your fast with God's will. By addressing these mistakes, you'll cultivate a more sincere and powerful connection with God. Fasting is not about showing off or following a ritual. It's about engaging in a genuine, faithful, and humble act of devotion to your Creator. If you found this helpful, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more biblical insights. Let's continue growing together in faith.